Everyone thought she was crazy. Who adopts a wild bobcat from a rescue center known for dangerous animals? In a quiet town outside Flagstaff, Arizona, 29-year-old Ellie Carter did just that. Neighbors whispered, friends distanced themselves. But Ellie saw something in that wounded creature others couldn't. And when disaster struck months later, it wasn't the humans who came to the rescue. It was the very bobcat they had mocked. This isn't just a story of trust. It's a story of transformation, love, and the unbelievable bond between a woman and a wild soul. The woman and the wild eyes. Sometimes the wildest creatures find their home in the hearts that hurt the most. The first time Ellie Carter laid eyes on the bobcat, it wasn't through a cage or under a spotlight. It was through the cold, flickering shadows of the veterinary room at Coconino Wildlife Rehab, just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The young woman stood quietly, arms crossed, boots damp with snowmelt. The scent of iodine and pine clung to the air. A half-dozen volunteers bustled around her, cleaning cages, sorting medical supplies, chattering about mealworms and raccoon kits. But Ellie's eyes stayed locked on the steel enclosure in the corner. Inside, crouched in the farthest shadows, was a creature that looked both majestic and broken. The bobcat, about 18 months old, weighing no more than 35 pounds, was a ghost of what a wild predator should be. His tawny fur was matted with dried blood, one of his hind legs wrapped in thick gauze. A gash ran across his cheek, freshly stitched. But it wasn't the injuries that gripped Ellie's heart. It was his eyes, golden, wide, watching, not afraid, not fierce, just silent. They called him Case Number 47. "He won't last the week," a young male volunteer muttered beside her, not unkindly. "Leg's a mess. Won't hunt again. The state's going to authorize euthanasia if we can't prove he can be rehabilitated." Ellie's hand tightened around her thermos, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Has anyone tried bonding with him?" she asked. The volunteer gave a dry chuckle. "Bond with a bobcat? That's not how this works." But Ellie wasn't listening anymore. Ellie Carter was 29, wiry and suntanned, with auburn hair that always found its way into a messy bun, no matter how many times she tried to tame it. Her face was dusted with freckles and smudged with earth most days. People in town called her the Forest Girl, sometimes with affection, sometimes with suspicion. She lived on the edge of the national forest in a log cabin built by her father, a retired ranger who had passed away the year before. Ellie had grown up with owls perched in windowsills, foxes sunbathing on her porch, and an orphaned deer once napping in her childhood bed. Wild things didn't scare her. They called to her. So when she looked into the eyes of the injured bobcat, it wasn't fear she felt. It was recognition. "I want to take him," she said that night, standing before the facility director, Susan Pryor. Susan blinked. "Take him? Ellie, this isn't a stray dog. It's a predator. He's not ready to go. Not yet," Ellie said. "I have the permits. I'll sign the liability waivers. Let me try." Susan hesitated. She'd known Ellie since she was a teen helping rehydrate owls. She also knew Ellie had recently lost her father, and maybe herself. "You know how people will talk." Ellie smiled faintly. "They already do." 2 days later, Ash came home. Ellie had given him the name on instinct. Ash, like the wildfires that sometimes ravaged their forests, destructive, fierce, but capable of regeneration, of rebirth. He was kept in a large outdoor enclosure she and her father had built years ago for rehabbing foxes. Double fencing, reinforced gate, plenty of space and perches. Ash didn't pace. He didn't snarl. He just sat in the far corner, his back to her, still and watchful. Ellie didn't force contact. She knew better. She followed a rhythm. Approach slowly, speak softly, never stare too long. Every morning she'd leave his raw meat and step away. Every night, she'd sit just beyond the fence and read aloud from old books. Jack London, Mary Oliver, quiet poetry about wild things and lonely places. Her voice was soft, steady. Weeks passed. The snow thickened and Ash began to limp less. Ellie noticed he started sleeping closer to the gate. One morning, she found him lying in the sun just a few feet from where she sat, eyes half-lidded. The breakthrough came on a late February evening. The sky was blushed with pink. Ellie was seated by the fence, elbows on her knees, when Ash rose and padded slowly toward her. Her breath caught. Every instinct told her not to move. He stopped inches away, golden eyes piercing hers. And then, in one slow movement, he pressed his head gently against the fence. Ellie's hand moved forward, slowly, fingers trembling, until they rested against the wire. Ash didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes. Connection. A single moment. That's all it took to light a spark between two souls, scarred in different ways. From that day forward, the bond only grew. But not everyone was impressed. 2 weeks later, while Ellie was picking up supplies at the Flagstaff feed store, she overheard it. "Did you hear she took in that bobcat? Living alone with it, out in those woods? She needs help. She's gonna get herself mauled, or worse." "People think animals are pets. That's how tragedies start." Ellie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because back home, as the wind howled across the forest canopy, a once wild creature was curled in the straw by her porch, eyes closed, heartbeat calm. Home. And in her bones, Ellie knew. They hadn't saved him. He was saving her too. But the world doesn't always understand what it hasn't seen with its own eyes. And soon, that misunderstanding would lead to more than gossip. It would become a threat, one Ellie could not ignore. But before that storm came, there was trust and love and a wild thing learning what it meant to rest. Training trust. Trust isn't demanded. It's earned, breath by breath, moment by moment. The snow began to melt slowly in early March, revealing the dry pine needles and faded leaves that had slept beneath it all winter. The high desert landscape around Ellie's cabin stirred with quiet life. Mule deer tracks, the soft hum of insects, and in the distance, the echo of an elk's call. Ash had started to move with more confidence in his enclosure. The limp was nearly gone, though his leg would always carry a subtle stiffness. Ellie noted every shift, how he circled before lying down, how his tail flicked with mood, how he no longer flinched when her voice broke the silence. He still didn't approach her often, but he watched her constantly. And she never looked directly into his eyes too long. She knew better. In the wild, a direct stare from a human could mean challenge or threat. Instead, she worked on routine, predictability, safety. Every morning at 7 a.m., Ellie would unlock the outer gate, step in slowly, and place his morning meal, venison or chicken, on a flat stone inside. She'd then sit several feet away and sip her coffee, talking softly about nothing at all. The weather, her plans for the day, the book she was reading. She made herself part of the rhythm of his world, not the center of it. Ash would sometimes eat while she sat nearby, sometimes wait until she'd left. But one thing was constant. He never took his eyes off her. And Ellie never reached for him, not once. Then came the first unexpected act, small, but unmistakable. It was early evening. The sun was casting long amber streaks through the trees. Ellie, bone-tired from reinforcing a segment of the fence, sat beside the enclosure, her boots off, socks damp from melted snow. She was humming some half-remembered folk tune from her childhood. Ash, lying under a crooked pine branch inside the enclosure, rose to his feet and approached the fence. Not slowly, not cautiously, but with purpose. He sat down directly in front of her, only the chain link between them. Ellie blinked, unsure what to do, so she kept humming. After a few moments, Ash leaned forward and nudged the fence with his nose. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't hunger. It was a test. Ellie slowly leaned forward and mirrored the motion, her forehead resting lightly against the cold metal. They stayed like that for nearly a minute, breathing in the same rhythm, eyes closed. The wind stirred the trees around them, but in that little clearing, time held its breath. Later, Ellie would write in her notebook. Day 39, he chose to come close. Not for food, not for control, just to be near me. I didn't cry, but I wanted to. Outside the enclosure, the world kept turning. But inside, something was beginning to bloom. A wild, fragile thing called trust. And for the first time in years, Ellie felt her own walls soften too. The first touch. It only takes one moment, one heartbeat of trust, for everything to change. The wind was colder than usual that morning, carrying the sharp bite of late winter despite the clear skies. Ellie pulled her flannel tighter around her shoulders and stepped outside, mug in hand, boots crunching softly against frost-laced gravel. She was already talking before she reached the enclosure. Morning, Ash. The magpies are up early today. I'm betting it's gonna snow again. Ash was already waiting, sitting near the gate, his ears alert, eyes calm. That was new. He'd begun meeting her at the edge more frequently now, each visit drawing a little closer, a little bolder. There was no rush in his movement, no twitch of suspicion, just quiet, deliberate presence. This time, as Ellie placed his food down and sat cross-legged beside the fence, she noticed something different. Ash didn't go to eat. He came to her. His steps were soft, padded. Every muscle in his sleek body moved like coiled silk. He stood just inches away from the fence, his golden eyes scanning her hands. Ellie froze, not from fear but reverence. Slowly, with a breath held deep in her chest, she reached out through the gap in the chain link. Her fingers hovered in the air, open palm, no expectations. Ash studied her for a moment that stretched on forever. Then, with the gentlest motion, he leaned forward and pressed his cheek into her hand. Her fingers trembled against his fur, coarse around the edges, but warm underneath. The weight of his face rested there, as if he'd been carrying it for too long, and had finally set it down. Ellie didn't speak. Words didn't belong in moments like this. Instead, she let her hand rest against him, lightly tracing the edge of his jaw, then the curve of his ear. Ash let her, for the first time. She felt the slow thrum of his breath, the tension in his body melting like snow beneath sunlight. A wild creature, broken and battered, was choosing connection. Her heart swelled. After a minute, Ash stepped back, gaze steady. Then he turned, walked to his food, and began to eat. Ellie sat there, still kneeling, her hand tingling from the electricity of it all. She didn't move for several minutes. Not until a jay shrieked in a nearby pine, startling the silence back into motion. Later, when she journaled the day's events, she struggled to describe it. Day 44. He let me touch him. Not a snarl, not a wince, just calm. I think he knows. I'd never hurt him, and maybe he'd never hurt me either. But trust, Ellie knew, was a ladder with many rungs. One step up didn't mean safety. The next day could bring retreat, a hiss, a return to distance. Still, that morning changed everything. Ash was no longer a project. He wasn't a case file. He wasn't a wild problem to solve. He was someone. And in that recognition, a new kind of healing began for them both. Whispers in the pines. Sometimes, what people fear most isn't danger. It's what they don't understand. Word travels fast in a small mountain town, especially when it's wrapped in fear. At first, it was just a whisper or two at the local feed store. Then the coffee shop chatter picked it up. Before long, even the grocery clerk at Morrison's was talking about it. "Did you hear? Ellie Carter's keeping a bobcat, like a real one, in her backyard." The words passed from lips to ears, with growing disbelief, then concern, then full-blown judgment. The isolation Ellie once treasured now became the reason people started to worry. She lived alone, no husband, no kids, just a cabin at the edge of Coconino National Forest, and now, apparently, a wild predator pacing behind fences. The bobcat, they said, was a ticking time bomb. At the Wildlife Center, staff began pulling back. Volunteers who once joined her on feed runs made excuses. "Sorry, Ellie, I've got too much going on at home." Susan, the director, who had originally signed off on the transfer, became cold and distant. "Just be careful," she said flatly one afternoon. "You're responsible for whatever happens out there. Don't make us regret this." Even people she considered friends, neighbors she'd known since high school, grew quiet around her. The worst was Angela Brooks, her old hiking partner and friend from town. One morning at the farmer's market, Ellie spotted her buying apples with her son. She walked over, hoping to catch up, but Angela stepped back. "I heard what you're doing, Elle," she said, eyes flicking with unease. "You've always been into wild animals, but this is different." Ellie's smile faded. "Ash isn't a threat. He's healing. I'm not trying to turn him into a pet. "I've got kids," Angela interrupted. "We hike those trails. What if he gets out? What if he attacks someone?" Ellie stood frozen, the air between them heavy with unspoken things. She tried to explain about the enclosure, the double gates, the distance Ash still kept. But Angela was already walking away. That night, Ellie sat on her porch, Ash curled on the straw bed just inside his pen. The sky was a blanket of stars, the trees whispering ancient things. "Funny how they think I'm the one being reckless," she murmured, sipping tea from a chipped mug. "You're more cautious than any human I know." Ash lifted his head, ears twitching. He blinked slowly, then rested it back down. Ellie knew the risk. She never denied it. Bobcats were still wild. Ash could change, regress. If he ever escaped, the law would be swift. So would the fear. But fear, she believed, wasn't the enemy. Ignorance was. And if she had to stand alone to prove that trust, real, fragile, hard-won trust, could exist between human and wild, she would. Still, as shadows crept longer around her cabin, Ellie could feel something shifting in the air. The town wasn't just whispering anymore. It was watching. Ellie versus the council. When fear shouts, truth must speak louder, even if it trembles. The letter came on a Tuesday. Plain envelope, no return address. Just a seal from the Flagstaff, Regional Wildlife Oversight Committee. Ellie stood at her kitchen counter, fingers still dusty from tending the greenhouse. Her pulse jumped as she tore it open. It was short. Director. A community safety hearing had been scheduled for Thursday at 5 p.m. to review concerns regarding non-domestic animal housing at 237 Sycamore Ridge. That was her address. Ashes, the 2 days leading up to the hearing, felt like walking through fog, familiar woods that suddenly felt hostile. Ellie went through her usual routines, but something inside her shifted. She could feel it in the silence between the pine trees, in the way her neighbors glanced and quickly looked away. On Thursday afternoon, she stood in front of the town hall mirror, wiping dirt from her jeans. She braided her hair, slipped on her cleanest flannel, and grabbed her leather notebook. Inside were photos of Ash's enclosure, charts of his behavior patterns, veterinary reports, and her permits. But no document would speak louder than her heart. The council chambers were already full when she arrived. Townsfolk packed into rows of wooden chairs, whispering behind raised palms. There was Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge, the elderly couple from the hardware store, Officer Tomlinson, Angela. Even Susan from the rehab center sat in the back, arms crossed, unreadable. Ellie approached the microphone at the front of the room. 5 committee members sat behind a long desk, papers fanned in front of them. Councilwoman Hartman cleared her throat. Ms. Carter, you've been called here due to rising public concern regarding your relationship with a wild animal, namely, a bobcat known as Ash. Ellie nodded. I understand. Neighbors have expressed fears about their safety, she continued. Some feel this situation violates the spirit of the wildlife ordinances. Ellie took a breath. Her voice was steady, but quiet. I know how it sounds. A woman alone with a bobcat? It's not exactly normal, but this isn't about a pet, it's about recovery, for both of us. A few people shifted uncomfortably. I'm not asking you to believe Ash is tame, she went on. He's still wild, but he's not dangerous, not anymore. I've spent every day earning his trust, not forcing it. He chose to stay. That means something. From the back, a man scoffed. Until he decides to pounce. Ellie turned toward the crowd. You're scared of what might happen. I get that. But fear shouldn't be what drives policy. Look at the facts. His enclosure is reinforced. There's a double gate system. I've had 0 incidents. You've got my records right there. She pointed to the packet in front of the council. I'm not asking for applause. I'm just asking for the right to continue helping him heal. Safely, quietly, on my own land. Silence fell. Then Councilman Becker leaned forward. If anything happens, even a scratch, we revoke the permit. Ellie met his eyes. Fair enough. Outside, the sun was setting behind the peaks. Ash waited at home, pacing calmly in the golden light. The hearing had ended, but the scrutiny had only just begun. Smoke in the wind. The wild warns us in whispers long before the fire ever roars. The first sign was in the air. Not flames, not heat. Just a shift in the wind. It came at dusk, subtle but unmistakable. A faint metallic scent, dry and sharp like scorched pine needles. Ellie stood on her porch with a mug of tea, her boots resting on the railing, and inhaled instinctively. Her nose wrinkled. Ash noticed it first. He had been lounging atop his favorite perch inside the enclosure, eyes half-lidded in that lazy, feline way. But now his ears stood rigid, swiveling, his head lifted, muscles tensed beneath his coat like drawn wires. Then came the sound, a low, distant hum. Ellie squinted toward the western ridge. Over the treetops, just barely, a line of smoke twisted skyward, gray and orange. A gust of wind carried the bitter smell stronger now, undeniable. She set the mug down. Fire, she murmured. Too close. The forest wasn't new to flames. Arizona's high country had seen its share of blazes, and Ellie had grown up with evacuation drills, smoky skies, and air quality warnings. But this one wasn't on the news. Not yet. This one was just starting, and it was moving fast. She went into motion. The emergency radio flickered alive as she turned it on, static breaking through. Forest Service confirms a lightning strike near Cinder Pass. Containment efforts underway. Evacuation not yet mandatory, but residents within 5 miles advised to prepare. Ellie's cabin sat just inside the 6-mile marker. She knew how fast that margin could shrink. By the time she gathered the go bags, Ash was pacing the fence line. His behavior had changed. No longer calm, no longer measured. He was agitated, circling with sharp turns, tail twitching, eyes locked on the woods. She approached the gate and unlocked the outer latch. Her voice was steady, though her heart wasn't. It's okay, Ash. We're gonna leave soon. Just need to stay calm. But he wouldn't calm. He yowled, a sound she hadn't heard in months, and scratched at the fence, not in fear, but urgency. That's when the wind shifted again. Hard. It slammed through the trees like a freight train, bending branches and carrying with it a wave of ash. Soft flakes that danced like snow through the air and settled on her porch rail. She looked west again. The smoke was no longer a line. It was a wall. Orange glowed at its base. The fire was no longer coming. It was here. Her truck's engine roared to life as she threw her bag inside, but as she turned to unlock Ash's cage, a deafening crack stopped her cold. A pine tree half a mile down the slope split and fell, blocking the gravel road that was her only route out. Her breath caught. No signal, no time. "Ash!" she shouted. But the bobcat had already leapt from his perch, landing beside the gate. And then he ran. Not away, forward, into the trees. Ellie stood frozen, because somehow, deep in her bones, she knew. He wanted her to follow. The cliff rescue. When all paths are lost to flame, instinct becomes the only map. Ash disappeared into the woods like a wisp of smoke, vanishing between pine trunks and shadows. Ellie hesitated for just a heartbeat, then ran. Branches whipped at her face. The emergency pack on her shoulder bounced with every stride. Her lungs burned with the effort, but she kept her eyes locked on the flicker of movement ahead, the soft, silent shape of the bobcat weaving through brush with practiced ease. "Ash!" she gasped, not in command, but desperation. He didn't stop. He didn't slow. He knew where he was going. Ellie followed blindly, the fire growing behind her with terrifying speed. The smell was stronger now, acrid and raw, and the wind carried embers that floated like stars through the thickening dusk. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the roar, like a freight train barreling through the trees. The wildfire had crowned. It wasn't crawling anymore. It was running, and they were running from it. The terrain sloped downward sharply, and Ellie nearly lost her footing on a patch of wet leaves. She skidded, caught herself, and glanced up to find Ash standing on a rocky outcrop up ahead, staring at her. Then, without a sound, he turned and slipped over the edge. She scrambled after him, grabbing roots and jagged stone. When she crested the rise, her breath caught in her throat. They were at the top of a game trail, a narrow, winding path etched into the side of a cliff. She recognized it faintly from her childhood, an old cougar path her father had shown her once during a fire drill hike. It wasn't marked on any modern map, and it hadn't been walked by human feet in years. But Ash knew it. He was already halfway down the path, careful, deliberate. He paused every few yards to look back at her, as if checking that she was still coming. Ellie's heart thundered in her chest, not just from the climb, but from the drop. To her right, the cliff fell away into a ravine at least 200 feet deep. The wind howled against the rock face. One wrong step. She took a breath and started down. Ash moved like a ghost ahead of her, a golden shadow against the growing smoke. The sky behind them glowed blood orange as firelight danced against the ridge. They kept moving. Minutes blurred into miles. Ellie didn't know how long they'd been walking, only that the heat behind her was fading, replaced by cool air and the smell of river water. And then, at the base of the trail, a clearing opened up. And in that clearing, headlights, a red Forest Service truck. Two men in flame-retardant gear stood beside it, eyes wide as they spotted the woman and the bobcat emerging from the smoke. "Ma'am," one shouted, "you okay? Did that animal lead you here?" Ellie stumbled into the light, coughing. Ash stood beside her, chest rising and falling, body trembling. She nodded slowly, voice raw. "He saved me." One of the firefighters looked at Ash with disbelief. "I've seen animals run from fire. Never seen one lead someone through it." Ellie looked down at the bobcat. His fur was singed at the edges. His side heaved with exhaustion. But his eyes, they were calm. And for the first time since the flames began, she let herself cry. Not in fear, but in awe. Because this wasn't just survival. This was trust. This was love. This was a wild heart choosing to protect her, even when the world said he couldn't. Ellie's story goes viral. The world didn't believe until they saw the fire in his eyes and the woman he chose to save. Ellie didn't mean to become a headline. She hadn't posted a single photo of Ash in over 6 months, not since the whispers in town started, not since people had begun treating her like a time bomb with fur and claws. But that changed the morning after the fire. She sat in the temporary shelter, wrapped in a wool blanket, sipping weak coffee from a paper cup. Her cabin had been spared, barely. The fire crews told her the winds shifted at the last moment, sparing her ridge but devouring everything east. Ash was lying quietly at her feet, on a blanket the medics had laid out for him. His sides still rose and fell too quickly, but the vet had said he would recover. Some singed fur, slight dehydration, nothing worse. When the local news team showed up, Ellie was still wearing her smoke-streaked flannel and had dirt in her hair. "You're the woman the bobcat led down the cliff trail?" the reporter asked, adjusting her mic. "They're saying he saved your life." Ellie glanced down at Ash. His golden eyes met hers for just a second. "I followed him," she said simply. "He knew the way. I didn't." The interview was short. No dramatics, just honesty. She showed the camera crew Ash's enclosure, still standing, the scorched trees in the distance. She didn't beg for sympathy. She didn't preach. But by the next morning, the video had over 4 million views. Arizona woman saved by bobcat during wildfire. The wild creature who became her guardian. Proof that trust can be earned, even in the wild. Emails flooded in. Messages from strangers all over the country. Wildlife biologists, veterans with PTSD, animal lovers, skeptics turned believers. Some sent art. One woman in Oregon painted a portrait of Ash, leaping through smoke, his eyes fixed on something unseen. A science teacher from Utah wrote, "I showed your video to my 7th grade class. We had a full discussion about trust, instinct, and how we treat animals we don't understand." Offers came in, TV appearances, book deals, podcast interviews. Ellie turned most of them down. She wasn't interested in fame. She wasn't trying to prove anything. But one email stopped her cold. It was from a girl named Kaylee, age 11, from Wisconsin. "Dear Ellie, my friends at school say I'm weird because I don't talk much. But I have a cat named Blue, who always sits with me when I cry. When I saw your bobcat helped you, I knew I wasn't weird. I think animals know more than people think. Thank you for showing that. Love, Kaylee." Ellie printed it out and taped it to the inside of Ash's gate. That night, as the stars rose over the smoldering forest and Ash lay curled near the embers of their past, Ellie whispered softly, "We didn't just survive, Ash. We started something." And this time, she wasn't alone in believing it, from threat to local legend. Sometimes the ones we fear most become the ones we can't live without. It didn't happen overnight, but the change came. First in small ways. The glances from townspeople that once carried suspicion now held something softer. Curiosity. Maybe even respect. Then came the mural. It was painted on the side of the old general store downtown, an enormous depiction of Ash, mid-stride through smoke, his golden eyes shining like lanterns. Behind him, the faint outline of a woman followed, hand outstretched, eyes wide but trusting. Below, in bold forest green, were the words, "Wild hearts protect too." Ellie stood before it, the day it was unveiled, arms crossed, unsure what to say. Beside her, Angela Brooks, yes, the same Angela who once clutched her child tighter and turned away, stepped forward with a quiet smile. "My son asked if he could be brave like the Bobcat," she said. Ellie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because suddenly Ash wasn't just the animal behind the fence anymore. He was the reason Ellie was still alive. He was the symbol of something the town had forgotten: balance, coexistence. That wild didn't always mean dangerous. Soon, a small wildlife education initiative started at the local school. Ellie was invited to speak. She brought photos, enrichment tools, even casts of bobcat tracks. She told the children stories, not just about Ash, but about patience, about waiting quietly for trust to grow like a pine shoot in stone. A boy in the front row asked, "Did you ever teach him tricks?" Ellie smiled. "No," she said. "He taught me." They started calling it the Ash Program: lessons in wildlife safety, respect, and understanding. Other animal stories filtered in: a rescued hawk nursed back to flight, a one-eyed fox who lived on the edge of the preserve. But Ash remained the heart of it all. Local businesses printed T-shirts. The feed store sold mugs with his silhouette stamped across the front. Donations rolled in for the rescue center, enough to build 2 new enclosures and restock the veterinary supply shed. Even the town council, once so quick to threaten her permit, voted unanimously to recognize Ellie as a local conservation partner. But Ash didn't care about any of that. He still lounged in the morning sun, stretched across his platform, still watched the hummingbirds with the same curious tilt of his head, still greeted Ellie every evening with that slow blink she'd come to love more than anything. Until one day, he didn't. It was late spring when she found the gate still latched, but the enclosure empty. No broken locks, no sign of panic, no blood, no claw marks, just absence. And tracks, heading toward the forest, clean, confident, chosen. Ellie stood at the edge of the trees for a long time. She didn't call his name, didn't chase. She just whispered, "Thank you," and let him go. Because some wild hearts stay only as long as they're needed. And Ash, he had given her everything, the years after. You never truly say goodbye to a soul that changed your life. You carry them forward in every quiet moment. 5 years passed. The forest healed, though the blackened trunks still stood like ghosts in some corners, tall and silent reminders of the fire. Nature had begun its slow rebirth. Green shoots pierced through charred soil. Birds nested again in branches once stripped by flame. And Ellie Carter? She had changed too. Her cabin was no longer just a haven for one wild heart. Over time, it became a sanctuary, officially recognized, locally supported, and widely respected. She now housed a rotation of injured or orphaned creatures: a red-tailed hawk with a damaged wing, a fox cub with frostbitten paws, even a pair of opossums who refused to be released. Each had their own story, their own recovery, but none were quite like Ash. Nothing ever would be. On the wall above her writing desk hung a single photo: Ash, poised on the rocky outcrop the day after the fire, golden eyes steady as sunrise. It wasn't posed. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. The day after he left, Ellie had cried, not in grief, but in gratitude. His absence hurt, but it was the kind of ache that reminded you something beautiful had once lived beside you. In the years that followed, she wrote. Her book, The Wild One, Who Stayed Just Long Enough, became a national bestseller. Not because it was dramatic or flashy, but because it was honest. In it, she told the truth. About fear, about trust, about how humans so often misunderstand what they don't control. Reviewers called it raw and reverent. Others called it a love story disguised as a wildlife memoir. She didn't care what label it carried. To her, it was a thank you letter. Each fall, Around the anniversary of the fire, she hosted a trail walk for the community, an educational hike through the very path Ash had led her down. She guided kids and adults along the narrow ridges, stopping to point out scat, tracks, bird calls. At the bottom, she'd always pause. "This is where he stopped," she'd say, touching the stone where Ash once turned to wait for her. "This is where he made sure I was okay." People left flowers there, sometimes, painted rocks, little pine cone sculptures made by children. The legend of Ash had grown, but Ellie never exaggerated it. She never needed to. The truth was enough. Even now, she still woke up early each morning and walked the tree line with her coffee, just in case. She told herself it was habit. But deep down, she hoped. Not that he'd come back, not permanently. Just once. Just long enough for her to whisper thank you one more time. The final glimpse. Some goodbyes are whispered from a distance, written not in words, but in wild footsteps, fading into the trees. It was late October when it happened. The first snow had just dusted the mountain ridge, clinging to the pine needles like powdered sugar. Ellie had woken early, as usual, brewed her coffee, and stepped outside into the morning stillness. The forest air was crisp, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the world was wrapped in quiet silver light. She walked her usual route, down the porch steps, along the back trail near the river bend, past the old fence that had once kept Ash safe. But something stopped her. A sound, soft, almost inaudible. The crunch of paws on snow, not heavy like a deer, not skittish like a rabbit. Deliberate, silent. Her heart caught before her breath did. Slowly, Ellie turned. And there he was, standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet away, half veiled in the low mist. Ash. He was leaner now, but still strong, muscle beneath fur, that familiar ruff of thick hair around his neck, glistening faintly with melting snow. His tail flicked once. His ears were high. His eyes, golden as firelight, met hers across the stillness. For a moment, neither moved. Ellie didn't blink. She didn't speak. She simply looked. And he looked back. There was no need for closer distance, no need for touch or sound. He was as wild as the wind now, untethered, whole. But she could feel it, he remembered. And somehow, that meant everything. After a few heartbeats, Ash blinked slowly, turned his head toward the rising sun, and walked back into the woods. Not hurried, not afraid. Just gone. Ellie stood frozen for a while. The snow continued to fall, soft as breath. Finally, she whispered into the air, "Goodbye, boy. You can go now." But in her heart, it didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like peace. Later that morning, she returned to the cabin and opened her notebook. She wrote one final entry beneath years of scribbled thoughts and wildlife logs. Day 1827, he came back. Not to stay, just to let me know he made it. And that I did too. She closed the book and looked out the window, where the trees swayed gently under the weight of winter's beginning. Ash would never return again. She knew that. But his story, their story, had already taken root in the hearts of strangers, in the bookshelves of children, in the echoes of every trail that wound through the Coconino woods. And somewhere, deep in the quiet forest, a bobcat walked freely, scarred, silent, and strong. Not as a pet, not as a legend, but as a reminder that trust, once given, can change everything, forever. In a world that often moves too fast to notice the quiet ones, Ash and Ellie's story reminds us of something timeless. Trust is not built through force, but through patience, presence, and respect. Sometimes, the most powerful connections are the ones no one else understands until it's too late to doubt them. Ash wasn't just a wild animal. He was a mirror, showing us that healing is possible when we meet others where they are, not where we expect them to be. In your own life, who or what have you feared because you didn't understand it? What might change if you approached with patience instead of judgment? Here at Paw Prints and Stories, we believe that every creature, every person, carries a story worth hearing, if we're brave enough to listen. So if this story moved you, stay with us. More stories like this, real, raw, extraordinary, are coming. Your challenge? Spend just one day this week practicing silent trust. Listen deeper. Judge less. And when you least expect it, you might find that wild hearts aren't so different from your own. This is Paw Prints and Stories, where every paw print leaves a story behind.